Welcome to the second edition of Convention, based upon a new musical called Convention about the Constitutional Convention that created the United States Constitution. This was composed by one of our co-hosts, Judge Jim Gray, and two of his friends, Stephen Lawless and Joel Henry Stein. I'm Joellen Chatham. I'm one of your co-hosts, and I'm here with Bijan Kian, who you see in the red tie, and Judge Jim Gray. And also with us is our guest today, Bryan Santin, who is a professor at Concordia University, Irvine, and we'll talk about and introduce Bryan a little more later on. The purpose of Becoming America is simply to help educate Americans and our friends in the United States about our government, the Constitution of the United States, and more importantly, how it was created 233 years ago. Our purpose is to educate and hopefully to inspire, but also to entertain. And this is where the musical convention comes in. There's 17 songs in this musical, and each one of our 17 sessions will begin with one of those songs. And today, we're in the second song called Off to Philadelphia. Jim, what's this song all about? And you've got more than one person singing. Tell us about this song, Off to Philadelphia.
Well, it was written by Steve Lawless, and basically the underlying theme is you can't get there from here. So we're going to give the setting of what was going on around that 1787. They had rivers of mud instead of roads. We'll get into those sorts of things because the idea was too, actually, when they finally were in a ratification convention, New York was against it, Virginia was against it, and eventually Virginia did pass it. And it took a month for that word to get from Virginia to New York. It took a month. You'd think they could have used their cell phone, but somebody was going by a horseback. So that's part of what we're talking about here. Transportation was tough. Mostly they walked, but that's the basis for it. You know, we're here, but you can't get to there from here. And we'll follow that up a bit.
So here and there are actually different places, not just Philadelphia, but Savannah, Georgia, and New York City. Bijan, you're an American by choice. You were raised in a different culture. As an immigrant who loves this country, do you think it matters very much to understand America's history and understand at that time how these people lived? Or is it just something that's nice to know?
No, I really believe that as immigrants, we need to develop an understanding of what this country is all about, how it came to be the United States of America. What's the Constitution? What is this most amazing document, none like it in human history, that gives us the rights that we enjoy? I believe it's absolutely necessary, not a luxury, but a necessity for all of us to understand why we came here. We came here because that Constitution gives us the ability like no other country in the world. I can live 50 years.
Let me ask you, you came here 30 years ago. Why should you care what happened here 230 years ago?
Well, because of the Constitution, because the Constitution gave me the right to come here. I was just going to say, and to call myself an American without anyone ever questioning that. I could live 100 years in Germany. I cannot say I'm German. I could live 200 years if I could in a country with my family. I'm still not going to be French. And I could live in the Middle East. I could live in, Bahrain or the Emirates, but I cannot call myself an Arab I cannot call myself. It's only in America that I get the right to come here and call myself American, and no one will question it. And it's because of that Constitution, that magical document that we're talking about.
Well, the days they wrote it, they were very different times. Jim asked you one question. Who's singing in this? Who are the people? Whose voices are we listening to?
They're Broadway musical people that actually Joel Henry Stein is an arranger. He's a professional musician, and they were friends of his. So he got them together. He caused all of that to happen. Came out pretty well, though, I think.
So, Jim, we hear two voices in this song. There's a male voice and a female voice. Who's singing historically?
Well, that was the delegate Rufus King and his wife. So he was telling his wife, I'm about to leave and I've been summoned to convene. Well, why is that? And that sort of thing. So it's a repartee between him and his wife.
Oh, it's a great song and it's a lot of fun, and it does talk about muddy roads. So everyone, turn up the volume on your screen just a little bit and listen to Off to Philadelphia.
I'm off to Philadelphia. They've asked me to convene.
Oh, why is that, dear?
To make our Confederation just a little more lean and mean. Though some streets may be cobbled, and some just mud and dust. Duty though I'm hobbled calls, so I'll go wherever I must.
Yes, duty though he's hobbled calls, so he'll go wherever he must.
You're off to Philadelphia, be careful now, my dear. How long would you say it'll take you to get to there from here?
Not long, my love, 3 days or 4. There's nothing you should fear. I've spoken with an expert.
Who's that?
Oh, a guy named Paul Revere. He's spoken with an expert. Oh, a guy named Paul Revere. On the way to Philadelphia, a sinkhole opens wide. The trail becomes a nightmare. My horse's hooves just slide. Though journeying across the nation may take a month or year, it's surely no vacation, 'cause
Why's that?
you can't get to there from here. It's surely no vacation, 'cause you can't get to there from here.
So now we've called this meeting, we've called them to convene. We wait now for this greeting, but so few may have made the scene. We called on them to gather here, this May from everywhere. But now I think it's rather clear they can't get to here from there. Yes, now I think it's rather clear that you can't get to here from there.
All delegates, all gentlemen, all numbered 55. Though some delayed, they all obeyed, and at last have all arrived. Finally in attendance, at last the final mile. Each with his agenda, each with his own style.
Oh, come to Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. But plan a trip through hell, so you all need help from up above. The road is long and muddy, but worth it in the end. We need your help here, buddy, your country now to mend. We need your help here, buddy, your country now to mend. To form a quorum, enough from every state, and hope for some decorum as they entertain debate. So come to Philadelphia, come here from everywhere. We'll ring the Liberty Bell for ya, just get to hear. We finally got here, they finally got here. We're finally here from there.
Well, everyone, the song must have given you an inkling of what it was like to live in the United States, or at least in Philadelphia in 1787. But to give us a real background about what it was like to live in the United States 233 years ago, we have with us Dr. Bryan Santin, who's a professor of political thought at Concordia University in Irvine. He's got a very interesting background. He teaches courses in American literature and world literature, as well as history and political theory and rhetoric. So he's got a very diverse background. He also teaches a course in the Constitution at Concordia. He received his PhD from Notre Dame, and he's got a very intriguing book coming out next spring entitled Post-War American Fiction and the Rise of Modern Conservatism, a Literary History from 1945 to 2000. That will be out in the spring, published by Cambridge University Press. Bryan, thank you so much for joining us today. I've met you before, and you've got such an interesting background, but let me pose a question to you. Today, we live with instant communication. I mean, we're doing this from 4 different locations, and we're taping something very quickly. We can travel not just across the United States, but around the world in a matter of hours. We've got computers and microwave ovens and interstate highways, and we can go to the moon. It wasn't like that in 1787. Just what was it like? How did people live in those days?
Well, first, thanks everyone for having me. This is a real pleasure. Well, first you have to think about population and geography. So by 1787, we have roughly 3.1 million people living in the 13 colonies. By the 1790 census, we have about 3.9 million. And to put that into perspective today, the last census in 2010, we had 3.9 million people living in the entire state of Oklahoma. So not a whole lot of people compared to today. Geographically, if you go from north to south, you're looking at roughly 1,200 miles. If you start from the coast and you go inward, you're looking at roughly 200 miles inland. So right off the bat, the United States, before it was truly the United States under the U.S. Constitution, is still one of the larger nations compared to Western Europe. Right? Still quite large. Most of the people are Protestant, and that's coming from the Puritans and a lot of English colonization, of course. And then you also have Western European. African Americans make up about 20% of the population, and almost all of them are held in slavery, mostly south of Pennsylvania, and then what today would be Ohio, but before Ohio was a state, of course. The vast majority of people live on farms. That's the first thing to know. Over 90%. So as soon as you introduce farming, you're introducing a life that is structured by planting and harvesting in the different seasons, right? In terms of what people bought and purchased, they usually purchased farming equipment, guns, powder, utensils for eating, things like that. So, you don't have modern malls, right? You don't have a modern consumer economy where people are going to stores and buying things. Most of these families and farms are more or less self-sufficient. They're spinning their own cloth. They're making their own clothes, right? In terms of families, the families are quite large, right? You would have three children would be a smaller family. You're looking upwards of 5 or 6, and a lot of that has to do with life expectancy. So you're looking at 1/3 to 1/2 of all the children born in the colonies are not going to live to 16. And because of that high infant and child mortality rate, the life expectancy is just under 40 years old. When I teach my American Lit courses, I teach the Puritan poet Anne Bradstreet. And one of the things that shocks the students is that she has a series of poems, very short sonnets, and each one is a sonnet about the death of one of her many grandchildren, which is just terrible.
Bryan, as I understand it too, you had more children because that was your welfare, that was your retirement policy, that they were going to take care of you. And Ben Franklin was 81 years old during this convention, which was an anomaly, and George Washington was 55, so they were really elder statesmen, but there was a lot of infant mortality, and as you say.
Yeah, and the other thing too, you would have a lot of kids because it was a labor source. especially in the north, when you have these farms, the kids can labor quite quickly. And we have a conception of childhood that goes up to at least 18 legally today. But children were almost treated as adults. By the time they were 10, 11, 12, they were taking on a lot of what we would consider adult dangerous responsibilities.
Sure.
Brian, I have a question. Did climate have anything to do with life expectancy and quality of life altogether? In the northern parts, New England parts, the climate was cold and kept them away from diseases, perhaps. But as you moved further south, the climate changed and the life expectancy was affected adversely. Is that not true?
Yeah, and especially in the north, you have the issues with the cold. And then in the south, you have issues with cholera. There would be periodic cholera outbreaks. You had mosquitoes. So you had a lot of problems in the south. And this was reflected in the way that plantations would work. So many times the most dangerous in terms of disease exposure, those parts of the plantations would be worked by slaves and overseers. And then the actual slave owners would not be close to those dangerous areas, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, it is. It is. And is there any relation or correlation between the degree of tolerance for religions? We all know, these people came to run away from religious persecution of sorts, and then we know that they were not all that tolerant of other people. While they wanted people to accept their religiosity, they were not so tolerant of others in other parts. But in contrast, as we moved south, did we see a difference in culture? Was there more tolerance? Was it in any way related to the challenges that they have that brought them together beyond religion?
Yeah, definitely. So one of the authors that I like to teach both in my Constitution course and my American Literature courses is J. Hector St. John de Crevecoeur, who wrote Letters from an American Farmer, which came out in 1782. And there he writes about how in Europe, you have religion is a major fault line. And he says religion in Europe is like gunpowder that's ready to go off. But he says in the United States, there's so much more land and the boundaries are different and the states are not drawn up according to religious differences. He says it's like the gunpowder disperses throughout the land and you don't have the same kinds of religious conflicts. In the South, what's fascinating, if you look at the primary documents, is the relationship between Christianity and slavery. So the early on, slavery is an institution that is not simply racially based. There's a famous case, Elizabeth Key, in the late 1600s. She's an African-American woman who's enslaved. She sues and says, I should not be enslaved because I'm a Christian, and she wins. And this is something that people forget. Yeah, and so there were serious debates about whether Christians could be enslaved of any race. And then in the early 1700s, particularly 1705, Virginia passes the Virginia Slave Acts, and that makes it racially based. And then Cotton Mather gives his infamous speech or sermon, The Negro Christianized, which says that slavery is in fact biblically rooted and that slaveholders should not be worried about Christianizing their slaves and that it'll keep them slaves. And then on the other side, you have the Quakers and you have the abolitionists. So it's amazing, slavery as a touchstone. You have some Christians saying slavery is anti-Christian, others saying that slavery is biblically rooted. And I always say when I teach my Constitution course, you can look at the Civil War as a gigantic collision between two different definitions of Christianity, a Christianity of emancipation and a Christianity of domination.
We can't talk about religion and not talk about Rhode Island, a very unique colony at the time, where this novel idea of separation of church and state was actually practiced. And when I was walking through the streets in in Rhode Island, I saw the synagogue very close to the church, and I saw the roots of American tolerance. Can you share your observations of what made Rhode Islanders so advanced in thinking and so easily tolerant with such dedication, as if it was naturally configured into the, geography and into the culture? How did that happen?
A lot of that has to do with the Puritans and their roots in Calvinism. So the Puritans come over and they are trying to purify themselves not only from the Catholic Church, but a purer definition of Christianity from the Anglican Church, which they thought was still a little too Catholic, the accoutrements of Catholicism are still there. And so when they come over, they turn to John Calvin, who saw that, or who believed that law should be biblically rooted in the same way, in the state law. Someone like Roger Williams, who starts Rhode Island, says, no, law should not be tied to the Bible, because after the Protestant Reformation, you have people that are going to have radically different interpretations of the Bible. And you are going to use your interpretation as a way to oppress your fellow man. And there's an old quote that without God, all things are permitted. And I always think that in the United States, the concept of religious toleration inverts that and says, sometimes with God, if you think you are the special agent of God, then all things are permitted. And that, to me, that is kind of the core of religious tolerance.
Joellen, Dr. Chatham referred to the fact that I wasn't born in the United States and I didn't grow up here. And when you talk about people who come forward and introduce themselves as direct representatives of God, I'm very familiar with that concept, and I know how that happens and how easily oppression of thought takes place in that fashion. This is fascinating, Bryan. This is great for you to share all of this thought and experience with us and with our viewers.
Rhode Island was not the only colony that was tolerant. Pennsylvania was established for tolerance purposes. Maryland, especially toleration for Catholics. What's interesting is Rhode Island refused to even show up at the Constitutional Convention. And speaking of the convention, and Rhode Island was pretty far away, what was travel like in those days, Bryan? They didn't have interstate highways.
No, travel was really difficult. So usually it would take, if you were on horseback, maybe you could get 20, 25 miles if you were a young man and had a good horse. If you were in a carriage, things would be slowed down considerably. You might get 12, 15 miles in a day. You don't have an interstate highway system or modern roads really until the early 1800s. There's a funny story in Philadelphia. They're just starting to put in cobblestone streets in 1787 when the delegates are there. And apparently we've had from sources that some of the delegates had never heard horses walking on cobblestone, and they thought and felt that the noise was annoying them. It was a kind of noise pollution before noise pollution, which is kind of funny to think about them being upset about the noise of modern roads.
You know, Bryan, it's interesting going forward to when George Washington is our first president. The capital at that time was in New York City, and he became very ill in the early part of his presidency. And the people were so careful about how he was treated that they literally put rags on the horse's feet. So when they went by George Washington's residence, they wouldn't hear the horse hooves on the cobblestones. So that's kind of interesting.
Bryan, because travel was so difficult overland, the rivers and the ocean was pretty much the thoroughfare, from what I understand. It even said in the song we just heard that the trail becomes a nightmare, my horse's hooves just slide. No, it was a lot better. If you're going to go from Savannah to up to Philadelphia, you went by ocean, I assume.
Yes, and if you think of how easy it is to move cargo on a barge, much easier. And think about putting different cargo, even your luggage, for your clothes, putting that in a carriage. It was much more difficult. And we didn't really have, especially at the time, we didn't have the money or the tax revenue or the tax base to put together roads, right? I mean, this is one of the big problems with the Articles of Confederation, is that they can't properly tax the different states.
And they put in the Constitution the establishment of not only the postal service, but post roads, so that the mail could be delivered. What was Philadelphia like in those days?
So Philadelphia in 1787 is the largest city in America. That's gonna quickly be eclipsed by New York. So by 1790, New York is technically going to be the largest city according to the census. However, in the late 1780s, Philadelphia is definitely the center of wealth and power in the new country. If you wanted to see rich Europeans, if you wanted to see foreign government officials, you would go to that city. They would dine there in style. The wealthiest citizens in Philadelphia were merchants, and they had an interesting business style. They would import goods from Europe, and then they would resell them at really high profits, which was quite interesting. And the wealthy residents had brick homes, sometimes 3 or 4 story brick homes, and some of those homes would take up an entire city block. And they had gardens on the outside. And then what my students usually find funny is that they had necessaries, and that is an outhouse. And a necessary in Philadelphia, it gets cold in the winter, right? So you have this, you kind of have this ability to think, okay, what should we do? In the winter, you don't want the outhouse too far away because it's so cold. In the summer, you don't want it too close because it smells, because it's warm. So they would put it right in the middle, maybe about 10 to 12 paces outside of the house.
Well, we said we were going to set the scene. Bryan, you're really setting the scene when talking about the outhouse being closed or otherwise. But in doing my research for Convention, the musical, I used one book, which was by Jeffrey St. John, a different one, Bryan, than you mentioned. This one was called Constitutional Journal. And I'm going to give you a quote, because this was not written by the tour guides for Philadelphia, that they were saying that this was a rude contrast between the plantation owners, for example, who had a pretty standard comforts. They're accustomed to that real quiet life, as opposed to in Philadelphia, where, quote, the cobblestone streets are crowded with people and animals producing a symphony of sound. The warm days of May bring a visitor's nostrils odors of sewage from the Delaware River mixed with the smell of horse manure that is a feast for flies. Swarms of flies in the streets are joined by wind-borne mosquitoes from nearby stagnant water pools, making the city a candidate for fresh outbreaks of malaria and yellow fever. Like I was saying, it sounds quaint, doesn't it? But we kind of gloss over those sorts of things. But it was really pretty odoriferous, let's say.
Yes, it was. I mean, you had not only carriage makers, wagon makers, barrel makers, you also had soap makers, candle makers, right? You had brick masons, you had carpenters, you had tanners, right? So they would have tanneries where they would leatherize essentially the different animals. So you would have so many different smells. I think of this as captured very well, belatedly a bit, in Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. Whitman's poetry is all about the sounds and smells of New York City in the 1840s, which are not exactly Philadelphia in the 1780s, but it is a bit analogous.
The streets were dirty. They didn't have the modern sanitation system that we're used to. And you mentioned the necessaries outside of the home. Most homes, almost all homes, even in the city, had their own small gardens, where they grew their own vegetables. Many of them had chickens, small animals obviously for food. When it came to baking, all the baking practically was done at home, although there were many bakers throughout the cities, and the bakers, people could go buy bread daily and it would be fresh. But low-income homes, very often the wife would make her own bread, then take it to the baker to have it baked. No grocery stores like we know, not at all.
No, definitely not. There's one funny story too about Gouverneur Morris. As many people know, Gouverneur Morris had a peg leg. He only had one leg. And another story that my students like. So Gouverneur Morris was a bit of a ladies' man, and he used to have affairs with married women. And he was caught one day, ran out of the house, and then the road was muddy. And so he was tramping around in the mud, fell down, a carriage ran over his leg, and it was so badly broken that it had to be amputated.
Oh, what about the Western lands?
In the world back then, is that what you're saying, Bryan?
Excuse me?
There was justice back in that.
Yeah, actually, there was a funny quote. One of the delegates said, Gouverneur Morris is always making things difficult for us. I wish they would have ran over his shorter leg, is what they said.
We don't need to set the scene quite so.
Yeah.
Bryan, speaking of Governor Morris, he spoke at the convention more than any other delegate. He actually wrote the final draft, and we'll be talking about this later. He made some very important, innovative contributions to the Constitution. At the convention itself, 55 men were there most of the time. Which ones made the most difference, and who were the big dissenters at the convention?
Yeah, sure. I usually think of the convention's main people as about 6 main players. So of course you have General Washington, who legitimizes the convention. You have James Madison, the father of the Constitution. James Madison's coming with the arguments. He's coming with the details. There was a saying that went around at the time about James Madison: if the devil is in the details, James Madison will be there first to meet him. So he was really good at details, really good at understanding the structure of government.
Wasn't Madison really the force behind all of this? That he was kind of the puppeteer pulling the strings? He didn't say that much, but he was really in charge, wasn't he?
Yeah, he and Edmund Randolph, really. I mean, Virginia is the driving force.
Let me also say that he is a new father, a new daddy, so his perspective has changed recently. You have a little boy. Brag to us. What's your son's name, and how old is he now?
His name is Fitz, F-I-T-Z. Middle name is Patrick, so Fitzpatrick Santin. He is going on 8 weeks old. He's just beginning to sleep 4 or 5 hours through the night. So yeah, that's going fantastic. And I just wanted to add one thing, and this is something I tell my students when I teach my Constitution course. When you look back into the past and you see the flaws, warts and all, there's 2 ways to orient yourself. On the one hand, you can be outraged at the past and outraged at injustice from a presentist perspective, or you can look back even further back into history, into ancient times, and you can look at the United States and you can be amazed that it worked, and you can be amazed at how much they got right, considering how much was gotten wrong in the past, right? So not starting with outrage, but starting with the amazing moments that they got right is a different way to orient yourself, I think, to the past.
Here.
Bryan, thank you so much for your perspective and your interest in this. I think it is important for us to go back in history and understand the context in which the Constitution was written, how these people lived, what their lifestyle was like. If we understand that, we can understand better why our Constitution was written, and also why through the many years it has been amended to make it even better, extending rights to vote, to women, to the former slaves, ending slavery, and so on. So we appreciate very much your involving with this. And I understand we're going to have you again in the future. We look very much forward to it. And Bijan and Judge Gray, it's good to see you both, and we'll see you next time.
Indeed.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you so much.
Life is good.